Thank you. I have 7.5 minutes and I'm sharing time with some of my colleagues. Minister, can I first of all outline what I want to see arising from this motion, which I understand will not be opposed by government, and I will get to that in a few moments. I want to see a resourcing of the National Maternity Strategy. I want to see modern, fit-for-purpose maternity hospitals with modern, fit-for-purpose maternity suites for women right across this state. I want to see it for all women, and I want to see investment in all of our maternity hospitals right across the state. The Minister will be aware that while I accept Holles Street is not fit for purpose, and while some of the comments about the state of Holles Street may have been exaggerated, I certainly would agree with the Minister that it is not a hospital that's fit for purpose, and we do need a new National Maternity Hospital. But equally, the Rotunda Hospital has difficulties and challenges, as the Minister knows, and has for a long number of years been fighting for resources to increase capacity and to make it a better maternity hospital for the women who use that hospital. I can give many more examples of maternity hospitals across the state where we know buildings are antiquated, the services are not what they should be, and I think we all should commit to better resourcing maternity services as we go forward. I also want to see a new National Maternity Hospital. I want to see it built by the state, I want to see it managed by the state, and I want to see it owned by the state, including the land. Why? Because I go back to what you said to me last week when I asked you this question, Minister. This has always been what I would prefer as public ownership and to own the freehold. That's what you said when I asked you that question last week. Your preference was for public ownership. You also said at the time, Minister, that you had engaged in discussions with the St Vincent's Healthcare Group in relation to the ownership issue, and that is something that you had put on the table. Unfortunately, Minister, that's not what was said to us at the Health Committee yesterday, and what was said to us in the words of the chair of the St Vincent Healthcare Group, that there was no meaningful discussions over the course of the last 5 or 6 years on the ownership of the land issue. And it strikes me that while you say that was your stated objective, and while the Taoiseach says that was his stated objective, and while the Taoiseach states that was his stated objective, in reality the government raised the white flag on the ownership issue and just accepted what the St Vincent's Healthcare Group want, as opposed to standing up for taxpayers, standing up for citizens and getting the best outcome. Simply because St Vincent's Healthcare Group tell us what their best outcome is doesn't mean that's the end of the matter, when it is, after all, the taxpayer that's footing the bill. And when it is, after all, the taxpayer, Minister, that will also fund the day-to-day running of the hospital for decades and for generations to come. I genuinely believe, Minister, that the decision that was made today by Cabinet is the wrong decision. And I think it's the wrong decision because we have now signed up to a legal framework that is really complicated, complex, convoluted and, in my view, unnecessary. And it's all a product of the fact that we're proceeding to build, for the first time since Loan to Care, a hospital that will not be in full public ownership, and that will be a hospital run by an independent charitable company as opposed to a HSE hospital. I don't believe, Minister, in the 21st century, it's beyond us as a people, when we're building hospitals, that we build hospitals that are publicly owned, publicly run, publicly managed in the interests of the public and of patients. That, for me, is a very, very clear policy objective that should be met. We also heard an awful lot of commentary over the last number of weeks, and indeed months, if not years, that the Sisters of Charity were not interested in or had not got a preference to gift the land to the state, despite at one point them saying that they wanted to gift the land to the people of Ireland. We know now what happened. The land was transferred to St Vincent Healthcare Group. The Sisters of Charity, we are being told, have divested all of their interests in the land. I'm not disputing that. And the sole owner of the land is now the St Vincent's Healthcare Group. We had some very lengthy discussions, Minister, with the St Vincent's Healthcare Group board at the Health Committee yesterday. All of the questions about ownership were put to them. We put very straight questions to them. Who owns the land? They said, we do. They said, we do. They said the land the landowner, the landlord, and you can go back and check the record because I was in the room, Minister, you were not. They said the landlord is St Vincent's Healthcare Group. When I asked them who owned the land, they said the St Vincent's Healthcare Group. They said there was a lease arrangement. They said they did not say the state. They said with respect, if it's not questions and answers and over and back, I would give way to the Minister if that was allowed. But my point is, I had those discussions with them. I put very direct questions to them, and they were very, very clear that the landowners were St Vincent's Healthcare Group and that there was a lease arrangement in place between the HSE and St Vincent's Healthcare Group. And I put it to them very directly, who owns the freehold? They said St Vincent's Healthcare Group, because that is a fact. No matter how many times the government tries to spin it, that is a fact, and that is what they said. They also said that they were not going to give the land to the state. So if they're not telling us they're not going to give the land to the state, and they also said, and in fact, we had no meaningful discussions on that issue over the last while, then what's the issue then? If you're telling us that we own the land, and you're also telling us, and they're telling us that they won't gift us the land, it can't be both. The reality is that they are the landowners, they haven't gifted the land to the state, and if they did, we wouldn't need to establish the National Maternity Hospital at Ellen Park, that company, because we would be building a HSE hospital on public land. We would obviously have to have arrangements in place between the hospitals on the campus and the HSE hospital. There are different sorts of arrangements. We wouldn't need a company to be established that would then have directors coming from different sources. That would be completely unnecessary. That company would not need to be formed and then, of course, would not be a subsidiary of the St Vincent's Healthcare Group. None of that would happen. So you can't credibly come in and say there are no contractual issues, no legal issues, we own the land, and yet a company has been established to run and manage the hospital with a lease arrangement with St Vincent's Healthcare Group, and all of the complications and legal contractual issues with constitutions and licences and leases all in place for one reason and one reason only, because we don't own the land. And I said to you and I said to the Taoiseach several times over the last number of weeks, what efforts are being made to persuade St Vincent's Healthcare Group to gift the land to the state? And it again transpires from yesterday, again from the words of the chair of the St Vincent's Healthcare Group, that there was absolutely no communication from head of government, the Taoiseach, with the St Vincent's Healthcare Group. I think that's just absolutely bizarre and in fact unbelievable, given the importance of this. We're going to lock ourselves into a legal framework for generations to come. It was not the right decision. I'll finish on this, Minister. It's deeply cynical, by the way, not to oppose a motion, but at the same time having no intention of supporting it. If you're not going to oppose it, then vote against it. If you're going to support it, then implement it. And it seems to me that's not what you're going to do.
Deputy Cullen, could you formally move the motion?
I move the motion.
Yeah, so Deputy O'Reilly, 2.5 minutes.
I would invite Minister Butler, since she's here, to maybe correct the record in relation to what is and isn't a Nightingale hospital. And I hope that she has a Nightingale ward, and I hope she's brought herself up to speed with that basic piece of information since our last debate. Minister, you know what the concerns are, you've heard them. And, you know, I'm going to quote from a tweet, and maybe given all the circumstances and the trouble on Twitter, I shouldn't mention it, but sure, look, I'll go there anyway. Gav Riley said, referencing yourself, Minister, it simply wouldn't be possible for circumstances to arise that a woman would be denied an elective termination. If it were to arise, the Minister for Health could exercise his golden share. So the thing that can't happen might happen, and if it did, this is what would happen. So you see why there might be a little bit of ambiguity there and a little bit of concern just in that sentence. This thing is not going to happen, but if it does happen, the thing that's not going to happen, well, then I will step in. But you see, for far too long, to access healthcare, women in Ireland have had to go to the courts. They've had to petition their politicians. They've had to get down on their hands and knees and beg, or get onto their feet on the streets and demand that healthcare. But what you're saying now is there is a form of healthcare which should be available to women, which you say will be available to women, but just in case it's not, well, then I'll do this other thing. So that's, you know, sentences like that do not help. When people say they are concerned, you can't dismiss them away by saying, actually, I have this in hand, it's not going to happen, but if it does happen, I will do this other thing. So I'm sure you can understand, Minister, why people are concerned. Equally worrying is the fact that 1 out of 10 GPs are offering abortion care, 9 out of 10 maternity units are offering abortion care. So this is under your watch, and you're telling us to trust you. And you're saying, trust me, I'll sort this out. In the event that any woman is being denied an elective termination, I will sort this out. But you haven't sorted out the situation in 9 of the maternity units. So there are issues of trust here. And that's why we're here debating this motion, and that's why we need the assurance and the certainty that comes with ownership. And a leasehold is not ownership. In fact, the leader of the Green Party in 2017, and this is in the motion, said that the new NMH should not involve the creation of a lease arrangement, but rather the transfer of ownership. Nothing has changed in that time. He's dead right. He was dead right then, and he's right now. So I do hope, Minister, you understand where issues around trust have arisen, and some of the things that you have said have not helped in that regard. In fact, they have been counterintuitive, and that gives women pause to be very concerned.
Deputy Ryan,
Minister, over the last week there's been a lot of whitewashing. Ministers and backbenchers who previously had their doubts had those doubts swept away by a letter which contained no guarantee the full range of health options for women would ever be safeguarded. Maybe written on that page was a coded message to not rock the boat, to turn a blind eye to women's rights, and to keep your nose firmly out of the truck and out of the business of vested interests. I'm bitterly disappointed that the Cabinet decided today to drive a coaching forward to the clear wishes of right-thinking people. Everyone I speak to is baffled as to why we can't own the land and the hospital. We've had lots of talk about this transaction being compared to buying an apartment. This is a disingenuous attempt to discredit anyone who opposes this sellout. We now have a dodgy, intentionally fake contract which could see the rent jump from €10 a year to over €250 million over the lifetime of a lease. The Irish people have made it quite clear in recent referenda that we are a secular state and that religion is a private matter. What happens if the HSE is unable to stay for the duration of the tenancy, or for some unforeseen reason the state needs to purchase the freehold site? The government parties have a long history of pandering to vested interests. Healthcare should be for the good of patients and service users and not for profit. The government should not have approved this deal in its current format. There were no meaningful or serious discussions in 5 or 6 years, according to St Vincent's Hospital Group at yesterday's committee, and Deputy Cullinan has spoken to you around that. At the very least, Minister, you should have removed the phrase clinically appropriate. There is broad consensus that this could be removed. There is no legal impediment to gifting the land. The government yet again is failing women and has serious questions to answer. The solution is simple. We must have a public hospital built on public land. Anything less calls into question the government's commitment to sláinte care. I understand that there are some Green TDs wrestling with their conscience. I appeal to them in particularly now to draw a line in the sand and to support this motion. Thank you.
Mitchell.
Minister, I fully support calls for a new National Maternity Hospital to be publicly owned and to be built on public lands. Unfortunately, your government is ploughing ahead. The women of Ireland have campaigned for healthcare that is free from outside influences for decades, and they need to have confidence in the type of healthcare that they get. Their concerns could have been addressed, and concerns around a complex legal deal could have been knocked on the head if the government had kept their word and brought the site into public ownership. The government said they wanted the land to be gifted to the state. But yesterday at the Health Committee, we found out that there was never any meaningful discussions under this government and this minister around the purchase or gifting of this site. Was the government ever serious about owning the site? It doesn't look like that, Minister. The argument against public ownership seems to be that it will cause delays. Now, nobody wishes to see this delayed further, but we're discussing building a hospital at the cost of €1 billion. The Minister for Health, the Taoiseach and the Taoiseach could have resolved this issue. It is absolutely shameful that the government decided to sign off on these plans this morning. But you will have to stand over that, and you will have to explain that to your constituents. Nothing changed since it was paused, so it seems that committee hearings were basically a box-ticking exercise. Now, tonight should have been a chance for every TD to cast their vote, but the government will cynically not oppose the motion and speak out of both sides of your mouths yet again. Minister, the women of Ireland want a maternity hospital, and we want a maternity hospital that is publicly owned and built on public lands.
Thanks, Deputy Clerk.
Decades of women campaigning and fighting, and in some instances begging for healthcare, we are standing here today with a government that has signed off on a deal that fails to deliver a public hospital on public land. Instead, you have signed us up to some convoluted lease that will run for 300 years. It is obvious to the most uneducated person in economics out there that the investment of €1 billion would have been much better protected by ensuring that we actually owned the land that we were spending that money on. But yesterday we learned that the Taoiseach, the Taoiseach and yourself, Minister, despite being asked to sit down with St Vincent Healthcare Group and negotiate that transfer, no meaningful engagement actually happened to do that. Despite the government's stance that the transfer of land was some form of legal quagmire, we also learned that the Sisters of Charity did that without precondition. There was no legal barrier. Is it any wonder that women are so concerned about this agreement when neither Taoiseach nor Minister for Health have made any serious attempts to have this land transferred, all while telling this House that transition wasn't possible? We all want this hospital. Lord knows the women of Ireland need this hospital. However, the real issue here is the failure of government to secure the land into public ownership. And that phrase, clinically appropriate, that caused so much concern to so many stakeholders up to yesterday, seems to have completely disappeared. Poof, off out there into the ether, because Cabinet understands the meaning. There is now no need for legal guarantees. Trust us, take another leap of faith. Forget all the horrors that have happened in women's healthcare to date, because Cabinet understands. I don't know one woman who was willing to take another leap of faith with their healthcare, not even one, while barriers still exist out there. And Minister, you know well and truly that they do.
Deputy Tully.
Minister, I am very disappointed that the Cabinet agreed earlier today to sign off on the National Maternity Hospital going ahead on non-publicly owned land. And the question as to why the land could not be gifted to the state has never been answered. I mean, we have been told that the 299-year lease at the nominal rent is ownership in everything but name. But why can it not just be signed off and given at a nominal fee and make it ownership without question? I mean, the state's going to build a state-of-the-art hospital for the cost of €800,000 upwards. That's a huge investment of taxpayers' money, people's money. So people have the right to an assurance that the money invested will remain in public ownership, and the fact that the hospital will be built on land not in state ownership is very worrying. And the leaders of the three government parties have all stated in recent times that they believe that the land should be publicly owned. I mean, the Taoiseach said last year in March that I'm of the view that hospitals which are predominantly or overwhelmingly funded by the state should be in state ownership. The Taoiseach in 2019 stated here, it is our policy that the hospital will be publicly owned and the land on it will be in public control. And the leader of the Green Party in 2017 stated in the Dáil that the new National Maternity Hospital should involve not just the creation of a lease arrangement, but rather the transfer of ownership of the site to the state so that there is no uncertainty or lack of clarity on the ownership. No wonder constituents accuse politicians of promising one thing and delivering something else. I mean, also one of the key recommendations of the 2018 Day report was when the state is paying for a hospital, it should own the hospital outright. And this avoids complicated governance arrangements, any chance of limited services, and it safeguards the state's investment. So what we needed was a clean transaction whereby the Sisters of Charity gifted the land directly to the state. It was as simple as that. This would copper fasten the state ownership of the hospital and allay public fears. This makes infinitely more sense in protecting women's healthcare and the state's investment than a bizarre 299-year lease agreement. For too long in this country, women's healthcare and particularly reproductive healthcare has been neglected. We all agree that this hospital is needed urgently, but it has been discussed and considered for almost a decade, and yet this government has still failed to get it right, and women deserve better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Tully. Mairead Farrell. Sharing with Deputies Ellis, Cronin and Ward.
Gormagat Llanchoria. 12 years ago, the Controller and Auditor General identified some of the key risks posed by this deal. And in a section of their report called Protecting the State's Property Interest, they identified several alarming details. These included the fact that there existed a fixed charge over the entire St Vincent's Hospital site and a floating charge over all of the undertaking property and assets of SFHG, both present and future. The CNAG's worrying conclusion was that the St Vincent's Healthcare Group had, and I quote, pledged publicly funded assets as security for bank finance for the development of its private hospital. In other words, the land on which we are going to build this hospital has been used as collateral for other transactions. It was used as collateral to raise debt and for the development of St Vincent's private hospital and commercial car park. As a result of this, Bank of Ireland now holds a charge on this land. So not only are you proposing to build our new National Maternity Hospital on land we don't even own, the group who owns the land have a charge on it held by Bank of Ireland, which is a potential risk to the state. The 2018 Day report recommended that when the state is paying for a hospital, it should own it outright. That is the best outcome and way to safeguard state investment, option agreements notwithstanding. And 2 members of the HSE board also expressed governance concern if the state does not own it outright. And as Thomas Hubert in the currency.ie reported, St Vincent's Holdings Group was granted a temporary reprieve from non-compliance with its debt covenants, but this was pandemic relief and it's now about to come to an end. And Minister, this deal was so bad, I have to say I actually can't believe it's even gotten to this stage, and I have to say I really am outraged that it has gotten to this point and that we've had to raise it continuously, and that so many women activists have been raising it for such a long period of time. And it's fraught with risks and uncertainties, and it is unnecessarily complex and disregards established policy designed to protect state investment. And I have to say, Minister, I think it's a bad deal for women. It's also a bad deal for the taxpayer, and it's been creating a risk to women's health and risks to the taxpayer. And I have to say, lastly, Minister, I would just say that for the parties who consider themselves to be so pro-business, you are terrible at doing business yourselves.
The journey so far in the provision of a national maternity hospital that has got us to this point has been a long and convoluted journey that has become unnecessarily mired in controversy. Our existing maternity hospital in Holles Street is simply not fit for purpose, and the decision to relocate the hospital to a new site 8 years ago was well within its time, where it can offer patients improved modern facilities as well as better care for its patients. However, since that decision was made, the process has been beset by delays and reasonable concerns over its ownership, its governance and control issues. For such an important and major health project, it is hard to fathom that after almost a decade of work expended on this project, that there is very little to show for it apart from the escalating costs in its construction. A project that was originally to have costed in the region of 150 million is now being put at 500 million, with an added cost of a further 300 million for commissioning costs, which includes fit-out costs and transferring the hospital to a new site. The cost of the hospital has gone from its original target of 150 million to 800 million, another example of gross overspending on hospital projects. Legitimate concerns have been raised by concerned citizens and medical professionals that have not been sufficiently addressed and remain matters that are causing friction and needless controversy. It is important that the National Maternity Hospital has a secular ethos, and that both the hospital and the site it resides on should be fully owned and managed by the state. that the site is proposed to be transferred to a charitable entity called St Vincent's Holdings has also raised concerns for many people worried that the hospital will be unduly influenced by a religious ethos. There is also a fear that the hospital's legal framework, which talks of clinically appropriate treatment, is already being shaped by this religious ethos. People are rightly concerned that the new hospital will fail to deliver healthcare that is not approved by the Catholic Church. The new maternity hospital and its administration, its operation and its oversight must represent in all its aspects the inclusiveness of a secular body, and that is best achieved under full state ownership. Thank you.
Deputy Cronin.
Councillor Corla, what a desperate disappointment this cynical government is for the women of this state. And what a desperate disappointment it is for anybody who's interested in public health care. The ownership of this land for our new National Maternity Hospital was right there within our grasp, but this disappointing and cynical government didn't fight for it. Now we hear the chair of St Vincent's Healthcare Groups to be hauled in to correct the record, where he said the government had no serious or meaningful discussions to push for full public ownership. Yet in the same breath, the Women of Ireland and female government TDs are to accept a letter of comfort from this same source for their health and, more importantly, the future health of their children, their daughters and their granddaughters. This degrading government is not opposing our PMB. This floor show is so brazen, it's cowardly and it's cynical. The €1 billion of public money built to build a hospital on private land. Manana Heron heard but not heeded. In the uniform of the patriarchy, the leaders of Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and the Green Party, they tell us that they know better than us, that they know what's good for us, and they carry on regardless. This government has shown contempt for public health reform and your sisters in society by doggedly pursuing your belief that they know best, they know more, and that women should just put up, shut up and move on. Except the women and the men who've stood by us, who campaigned against this fudge, who rejected this ambiguity, who were incensed by the insult and uncertainty of clinically appropriate, will not move on. 100 years of Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael wasn't enough. You seem to have tied us into a lease for 299 years. But the resistance and the spirit of repeal, and that spirit will not be quenched. Repeal for some was only a veneer, a desire to be popular. But for Tá from Ná, women Maná na Héireann, repeal was fundamental. So gorgeous live, you heard us but you ignored us. But I can tell you that we are watching. And as most of the men on the other side of the House will know, women don't forget.
Ward.
Councillor, I want to start off by talking about a legacy of mistrust about religious orders having any connection with women's health care. I also want to talk about the historical abuse suffered by women and children at the hands of religious orders. And I also want to talk about the connection between church and state that led to this abuse of power. Minister, I'm a member of the Children's Committee that has been working through legislation on this historical abuse, whether that's in the mother and baby homes, whether that's institutional burials, including the bodies of children being dumped in septic tanks. And we listen to heart-rending testimonies about forced adoptions, women and children treated as commodities by church and state in baby factories. So if this government cannot see the upset that building a maternity hospital on land that is owned by a religious order, then you are more out of touch than I actually thought. And today, Jordan Leaders questions the Taoiseach reaffirmed the government's position that leasing the land from a religious order is effectively owning the land. This is nonsense. It makes absolutely no sense. A lease is a lease. If I rent my home, I do not own my home. The landlord owns my home. The Sister of Charity, in the guise of St Vincent's Holdings, are the owners and therefore the landlords of the land that the National Maternity Hospital will be built on. There is a yearly payment. This is not ownership of land. We are talking about a $1 billion investment in taxpayers' money being spent on this hospital. The state should own it outright. The Sisters of Charity previously promised to give the land to the people of Ireland. And that means a public hospital on public land. The government now needs to make this happen, Minister. The control of the land is very important, and with the massive state investment should come full ownership. The state has been in the grip of governments controlled by Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael since the inception of this state over 100 years ago. The reason that we need a National Maternity Hospital now is due to a lifetime of underinvestment in women's health care by both parties. We need a complete separation from church and state when it comes to women's health care. In fact, Minister, we need a complete separation from Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil when it comes to women's health care. And today you signed off on a deal that it's going to pass this through, but yet you're going to come in here and you're going to let this motion go through, so you don't want to have to be forced on it and to have the public outcry. This is definitely talking out of both sides of your mouth, and the public are saying through this, Minister. This is not the first time it's happened with CAMS, it's happened with other motions that have been put forward by oppositions, that the government sit over there, nod their head, let things go through and have no intention of putting things into place. It's a con job and you just need to cop on.
Thank you, Deputy Ward.
Everyone wants to see the building of the new National Maternity Hospital. However, it's been overshadowed by the government's failure to listen to the many concerns of so many people inside this chamber and outside. The simple fact is, a National Maternity Hospital built by the state must and should be built on land solely owned by the state. Long-term leasing is not the same as full ownership. And I think we have to nail the lie that both Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael have had plenty of time over the years to build and provide a National Maternity Hospital on public lands. There are two main reasons why the ownership matters. Firstly, it avoids the complicated governance arrangements and any chance of limited services. And secondly, it safeguards the state's investment, avoids legal problems down the line, or if any big private company got involved in St Vincent's, which they could, would see a health-for-profit opportunity. It would also give the government a bargaining chip, because at present St Vincent's Healthcare Group holds all the cards. The control of the land is of the utmost importance, and with the state's investment should come full ownership. I do not believe that everything has been done to acquire the site, and I do not accept that there is not an option that involves state ownership of the land. In my opinion, the question of why the state cannot own the land has never been answered satisfactorily. Every effort should be made to acquire the land and the gifting of the state to the land to the state, which was already promised at the beginning of this process. The Taoiseach and the Taoiseach and the leader of the Greens have admitted having concerns about ownership. In government, Sinn Féin would insist and work with St Vincent's Hospital Group to persuade them to gift the land and work with them to ensure the site's integration and cohesion is protected and delivers the best outcome for all. Again, the government are shamefully engaging in a smoke and mirrors by not opposing this bill, only to stop members on their own benches for voting in favour of this Sinn Féin motion.
Deputy Funge.
Thanks very much, Cian. Firstly, I want to thank my own colleague, Deputy Cullinan, for bringing this forward. Look, this is the conclusion of the debate. We know that there is very serious concerns, and they're not just concerns by us in opposition, but there's concerns by so many women throughout the whole country. And unfortunately, it comes as a result of the history of, the treatment by the state of women. And, we all know we've had several discussions in this chamber on many issues in relation to women, but particularly in relation to women's health. And some of those are not as historic as others. The cervical check situation, cervical scandal, that wasn't that far long in our history. There was issues around breast cancer screening. The list is endless. And I actually wanted to take the opportunity, because I think my colleagues have made the points that this does need to be a state-run hospital. I think it's really important. But there are so many medical services for women that are just not adequate, or that are absolutely not at the races. There's been discussions around menopause, and I think it really made it had to go to the point where there was discussions on the national airwaves, where people were ringing in to national programmes before, there's kind of been any sort of recognition of the amount of work that has to be done. And women literally left, like not being diagnosed as perimenopausal and all of the other things that come with that. I also want to mention endometriosis. That's a very serious condition that very many women suffer from. That is misdiagnosed, that is not treated, that is, countless women have difficulties and issues, and it can seriously affect fertility and other issues later in your life if it's not addressed. And last year when we were sitting in the convention centre, I told a story of somebody who is very close to me, who was misdiagnosed for years and actually was in the gown going down for a gallbladder operation at the age of 25, when luckily somebody had the cop on and the common sense to say, I wonder, should we do a scan of the uterus as well? Up to that point, imagine, that hadn't been done, and it was endometriosis. And they were about to remove this person's gallbladder, in the gown, ready, fasting from the night before. That's the type of service that women, unfortunately, have gotten used to. And they shouldn't. It's unacceptable, it's disgraceful, and by not having a fully state-run and state-owned hospital, women are afraid that this kind of treatment is going to continue. And that's not to even get into the whole debate on repealing the 8th Amendment that was successful in 2018 and the knock-on effect for that. I'm out of time, but I did just want to say that women have been failed so badly in this state. We have an opportunity to have a first-class hospital that we all want, that we all know is overdue, but it needs to be state-run and state-owned. Thank you, Ceann-Comhairle.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Cullinan.
Thank you, and I want to thank all of the speakers on all sides who spoke in this debate. And I'll start with I'll finish with what I started with earlier today, which is I want to see a National Maternity Hospital, and I want it built as quickly as possible, and I want it in public ownership, and I want a public hospital. But it is absolutely breathtaking and amazing to see the lengths that this government will go to sell what I see as a bad deal. This repeated assertion that black is white, that the state will own the land, when clearly the freehold of the land will be retained and owned by St Vincent's Healthcare Group, is quite amazing. And those who made that argument know exactly the point that has been made. The reason why a HSE hospital will not be built on that land is because St Vincent's Healthcare Group will retain the freehold and will retain ownership of the land. The reason why this new company, a National Maternity Hospital at Ellen Park, is being established is because St Vincent's Healthcare Group do not want a HSE hospital operating on their land, co-locating with the public and the private hospital that's there. And that, for me, goes completely against the spirit of Sláintecare. When they were asked what is their reason for not gifting the land to the state, they said they want an integrated model of healthcare, all of the hospitals co-located under the umbrella of the St Vincent's Healthcare Group, and the establishment of this company which is now going to run and manage the hospital. And it's also quite breathtaking that the government took a decision today, the Cabinet signed off on this, in the full knowledge that there was no real substantive talks with St Vincent's Healthcare Group over the last number of months, and if the chair of the St Vincent's Healthcare Group are to be believed, over the last number of years. There was no pressure brought to bear on St Vincent's Healthcare Group, either by the Minister for Health or the Taoiseach. There were certainly no high-level talks in relation to the ownership of the land. Instead, the white flag was raised, and all of the excuses have been rolled out as to why St Vincent's Healthcare Group simply will not gift the land to the state. And it is, I have to say, Ceann-Comhairle, deeply cynical that the government say that they will not oppose a motion, as I've raised this with you in the past on several occasions, and then not implement what the motion calls for. We're being told that the rural independents will call a vote on this motion, which is their right. So if there is a vote on this motion, let's be very clear what people will be voting for. Let's be very clear what government representatives will be voting for. They'll be voting on the text of the motion. And the text of the motion commits the government to pursue the full realisation of the promise that was made by the Religious Sisters of Charity to gift the land to the people of Ireland. The motion commits the government to engage at the highest level with the new ownership group behind St Vincent's Healthcare Group, St Vincent's Holdings CLG, to secure full public ownership of the site and new building, with all necessary safeguards, way leaves and guarantees to ensure the integrity, integration and highest quality of care on the site. That's what the government will be voting on tomorrow if there is a vote. So you cannot speak from two sides of your mouth on this one. Tomorrow you will have the opportunity to vote in favour of this motion. I hope that the government does. But if ministers and members of this government come in here tomorrow and vote in favour of this motion, which commits the government to do very clear and explicit things, that needs to be done. If it isn't done, that will be a deeply, deeply cynical move by the government. And I believe it will further heighten concerns that people have about this arrangement. And for those in government that came in again and made the point that this is ownership of the land, all of the concerns have now been addressed. There's nothing overly complex about this. And then you hear the Minister, as he did today, try and explain the very difficult, complex, legal, contractual arrangements which are being put in place. The new company which has been formed will have its own constitution. It will have its own board. The directors will come from 3 different sources, as we know. It will be a subsidiary of St Vincent's Healthcare Group. They own the freehold and they will have a lease arrangement with the HSE and a licence arrangement, and that company is owned by St Vincent's Holdings. So there is a huge amount of unnecessary complication around this. Why? Because they don't want to build a HSE hospital on that site, and that is the bottom line, and that's wrong. That's not the best way to build this new National Maternity Hospital. So you'll have your chance tomorrow, folks, and if you do vote for it, I can guarantee you that we will make sure to hold you to account, that you deliver on what you vote for, if it is the case that you vote for the motion.
That concludes our debate on the private member's motion, and the question now is that the motion be agreed to. Not agreed. Na chapti tar hevna tarishkana abradish ta. Shushatana gana abradish neil. Stolim gulin kesht richik votal. Insofar as a vote has been requested, it is deferred until voting time tomorrow evening. Thanks to all of you for your